Howdy, everybody. Get started in just a couple minutes here. Waiting for more people to join up. Looks like we only got, 6 people in here right now, roughly. Hopefully we get a few more trickle in as the minutes tick by. Hello there, Seth. Welcome. A little bit of a cloudy day here in Eastvale. Cloudy skies expected to burn off by noon today. And we'll have golden sunshine and hot weather as we have for the last few days. Boy, it's been hot out there, hasn't it? Yo, how's it going? Morgan, good morning to you. Evelyn, yo, yo, yo. Theodore, hello. Isn't the weather in the hundreds? Yeah, it's been hotter than a pistol out there, let me tell you. Hello there, Devin. Welcome. Joseph, good morning to you. Rhea, hello. Zoe, good morning to you. Thank you so much for tuning in this morning. I hope that all of your classes are doing well. In fact, hello there. Hello, everyone. How about this? Because all of you are chiming in this morning. First of all, that's great. Great for attendance purposes. That's fantastic. Thank you all so much. Hannah, we got, who else do we have here? Tim, Nahal, Caitlin, Vanya, Hannah, Dr. Zhang, Nicole, Daniel, good morning, everybody. Hey, do me a kindness, would you tell me what the best part, we want to keep positive and optimistic during this time, best part of the beginning of the school year has been for you. Take a minute, respond in the chat, everybody. What's been the best thing that's happened in the last 3 days? Hey, that's awesome. Winning Fortnite duos. That's excellent. That's hilarious. Thank you so much for the kind words, Theodore. That's very kind of you. Waking up early instead. That's been the best part. That's awesome. It is. I got to tell you, when I was a youngster, I used to sleep in too, Joseph. And boy, something about waking up early. It just makes you feel like you have more minutes in the day or something. Kind of looks like Adam. I think Adam Scott's from Minnesota too, if I'm not mistaken. Seeing your friends, that's great. Nahal, starting to realize that history it's a lot more than memorizing dates. It's great stuff. Being able to do something instead of just being lazy. Caitlin, excellent. Love that attitude. I love that attitude. Hello Kitty marshmallows. That's good. Never had Hello Kitty marshmallows before. Chicken cheeseburger for lunch with fried onions. That sounds delicioso. That's outstanding. feel like I'm being way more productive. There is something to be said about that. Isn't that something? Like I say, I've been coming into work. It's great. It's been a lot. I agree with you, Vanya. It's been one of those things where it's like you come into work, you wake up early, you get some things done, you got the rest of your day, and that's awesome. I love that. That's so great. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in this morning. We've got a lot of great things to talk about today. First of all, I want to make a couple of announcements about things. First of all, if you have not yet submitted the first 20 questions or so that I put up on Canvas for you, do feel free to submit that. You have until technically 11:59 p.m. to submit it on time. Now I'm going to try and put those in the gradebook. So if you can have them turned in by say 1 o'clock today, that'd be ideal, frankly. But if you don't hand it in today, you still have time to submit it for late credit for up to a week from today. But you do still have some time to get that assignment done, but I do plan on adding it to the grade book today. So if I don't have it by the time that I put it in today and you still submit it before 11:59 p.m., I will go back. You'll still get full credit for it. It'll just show up as missing until then. But do get that done. Also, there's another assignment on Canvas for you. It will be the assignment that will be due for Monday's class. Once again, you do have until 11:59 p.m. on Monday, but if you could do me a kindness and get that in a little bit earlier, that would definitely help me out, and I can keep your grades all up to date, and you don't have to worry about anything looking like it's missing in the grade book. But you do still have a little bit of time in case you have not submitted the questions yet, or the answers to the questions yet. So you're good to go on that. And then let's see here. What else was I going to say? Oh, and then today, I still don't have administrative privileges on my computer from the district yet, so I'm not able to install software on my computer. And what that essentially means for you guys is this. I am right now using the YouTube app to stream, but the YouTube app doesn't allow you to screen share. And so I have to install secondary software to be able to switch over to desktop view so that you can see the PowerPoint as I go through it, which I will be doing as soon as I get the credential to be able to install stuff on my computer, which I don't have right now. But until then, you can just open up the slides on Canvas. It's on there, and the one that you're going to be looking for, if you go to Canvas right now, you can get this ready to go. If you go to Canvas and you go to Files, after you go to the AP Euro course, in the Files section, you'll see a folder that says Lecture PowerPoints. And the one that we're going to go all the way through today is the one called An Introduction to Studying History. Now, these are in PDF format, and I deliberately put them in PDF format because particularly for Mac users, unless you have Microsoft Office, sometimes you can't open up PowerPoint files. And so, because they're in PDF format, you should be able to open it up, no problem. It's still going to look very similar to a PowerPoint. It'll still be in the same format and everything, but you should be able to open it up, no problem. There is another one on there, though, called Late Middle Ages. Now, if I was you, because we're getting through in the textbook side of things, we're getting through the late Middle Ages in the reading and doing the discussion questions pertaining to the reading guide and stuff. It might be good for you to pull up that late Middle Ages PowerPoint and kind of cross-reference the things that I have in that PowerPoint with some of the things that you're reading in your textbook and answering in your discussion. Now, on those questions, I just want to make mention of the fact that, once again, I don't have it set up right now so that when you submit it, it goes through plagiarism check on Turnitin. I am not going to be loading more work onto you today outside of the reading guide discussion questions, which I find to be very important because you got to read and do these questions in order to understand what's going on. So that's good that you're not going to be assigned any extra work. But what it means is it puts a special emphasis on please do your own work, because if you're just waiting on your friend to do the questions for you and then exchanging answers and stuff like that, you're going to miss out on potentially some important stuff. And then two, I'm going to recognize it, and then I'll start making it so that it'll plagiarism check to make sure that you're not submitting the exact same assignments as your friends are. I understand the the time considerations and stuff like that. But I do believe that I'm giving you plenty of time to get these questions done if you're being conscientious about budgeting your time effectively. For the next one, remember too that the first unit of this class is a little bit intense because we have to get through a lot of content in a relatively short period of time so that we can move on to bigger and better things. But the reading assignment for this next one is going to be a little bit more intense than most of the reading assignments throughout the year. I apologize to dump it on you right away at the start of the year, but it's better to get it out of the way first rather than start off slow and be behind. So please do your own work. Please be reading the textbook, answer the questions. Here's my suggestion to you. If you're worried about getting it all done, divide it up. You don't have to sit down and do the whole thing at one time. For example, for today's assignment that was due, you could have done, say, 5 questions on Tuesday, 10 questions on Tuesday, 10 questions on Wednesday, and then handed it in no problem today. Try and do that. Be conscientious about, okay, here's where I'm going to work to until today. That's my goal for today. I'm going to get up to number whatever. And then on tomorrow, I'm going to get up to number whatever, and then divide it out so that you're, making good use of your time and getting things done, but not like, leaving it to the last second and pressuring yourself unnecessarily. Okay, so at this time, go ahead and open up the PDF/PowerPoint that I told you about, the Introduction to Studying History 1. I'm going to pull it up on my screen. Once again, I'm not able to screen share, but I will have that capability hopefully quite soon. Until then, I'll just tell you where I'm at, and you can just follow along with me. So we'll start off at the beginning there. It says an Introduction to Studying History. Today, what we're doing with this PowerPoint, this is really a very kind of, it's generalized, but the idea behind this Introduction to Studying History is to begin to bring you back, to take you out of your current historical modern discourse and bring you all the way back to the late Middle Ages and begin to set up a little bit of the context, set the stage, if you will, a little bit on how different life was back 600 years ago. And I'm going to be talking about kind of a lot of different elements, from political to religious to economic. And on top of that, I'm going to be giving you a tool that you will use through the entire year that you can add to your tool belt as something of an analytical tool to help you to read a document, or, and it doesn't necessarily mean a textual document. I could be referring to a map or a political poster or a propaganda piece or a political cartoon or whatever it is, and be able to look at it through a little bit more focused lens of history. History is a really broad subject, and there's a lot of elements that go into history. And so to be able to kind of break it down a little bit and say, okay, what kind of history are we talking about here? Are we talking about religious history? Are we talking about social history? These are going to be the kinds of things that you're going to want to be able to do on a very basic level whenever you read a document. And so I'll give you a little bit of a tip towards the end of class today to be able to start doing that. And when we come back on Monday, I'll be giving you a primary resource that we're going to be using that tool to help to deconstruct this document and make a little bit more sense of it. So let's get started with this. How do I get an A in AP Euro? That's the first question. A lot of people are concerned about making sure that they maximize their grade in the class. Now, I will tell you that AP European History is a difficult class. It's considered one of the more difficult classes, particularly for a 10th grader. In fact, in some states across the country, they don't even offer AP European History in 10th grade. They only offer it to seniors. Here in the state of California, though, for the most part across the board, you take your kind of world history credit your sophomore year, you take your U.S. history credit your junior year, and you take your government/economics credit for your senior year. So here in California, we do AP Euro as a sophomore, which is a challenge for a sophomore because it's going to require you to really up your game in terms of your analysis. Many of you who sign up for an AP class particularly a class like AP European History, many of you are used to being the smart kid in class. Okay, but when we get to an advanced placement course, particularly a difficult one like AP European History, the bar is raised. And so for those of you who have gotten used to doing A's based on your raw talent, your raw academic abilities, or the fact that maybe you're just raised in the right household and your parents value your education and whatever else, okay, floating by and kind of just relying on your raw abilities in AP European History is probably not going to be a method that works out as well as it has in years past in your education. So it is going to require a little bit more diligence on your part to make sure that you're staying on top of what you need to do and preparing yourself for success. So your success in this class is dependent on your ability to read and extract important information from passages. As I said, we'll be going over a tool to do that. Use evidence to support historical arguments. Here's the thing about history, is that in history, everybody has opinions. We all have opinions on all sorts of different things, from things like movies or food or whatever else. Everybody has opinions, okay? And so opinions are held by everyone, but opinions are essentially weightless. They are kind of massless. They have no real, they have nothing substantiating them. You can have an opinion on anything and it doesn't need to be substantiated by evidence because it's just your opinion on something. There's a bridge that has to be crossed in order for an opinion to translate into a valid argument. And here in modern day times, in the United States, we live in a highly individualist culture, and there seems to be a lot of emphasis on valuing everybody's opinions regardless of what their opinions are. I will tell you that from a historical perspective, I do not subscribe to this mentality. I do not value opinions simply because they happen to be held by someone. I will value an opinion when it crosses that bridge over into an argument that is substantiated by evidence based in reality. And so, holding an opinion in history is simply not enough. We need to take it to a new level and substantiate our argument with valid evidence. And once we do that, then we can have a conversation about something. And remember too that that even controversial arguments are worth discussing so long as there's evidence to support them. One of the key factors in your education, particularly in history, but across really all subjects, is to be thinking critically. All right, to not just listen and to be told, but rather to analyze and to critique and to weigh evidence. These are the sorts of skills that are absolutely essential to becoming a thinking, functioning, rational adult. And frankly, not everybody has these skills, which is why it's so important to cultivate them while you are young. Remembering numerous dates. Now, when I say remembering dates, to be honest with you, because we've all lived with the internet for the majority of our lives, memorizing dates is not really a function of being a good historian. More, I would say, actually, the memorization of dates just happens to come along with practice. I wasn't born knowing all of the dates for the things that we discuss in this class. It's because I've had a lot of years of training and practice in doing my job that I understand what the dates are off the top of my head. For your purposes in this class, you'll never receive a test question that says something like, in what year did the Battle of Gettysburg occur, or whatever, okay? Or what year did the French Revolution begin? Those kinds of questions are not important to ask in history, okay? Because you can type that into Google and get an answer within seconds. So when I say memorizing dates, I'm really not saying like memorize the date of everything and everything that happened. What I'm really saying is you want to start to begin to build kind of a patchwork of a context of understanding when things happened in relation to one another. And the reason that this is important is because as you move throughout the course, and which moves largely in a chronological fashion with a couple of exceptions, you start to understand, like, okay, when I think 1400s, what do I think? I think Renaissance. When I think 1500s, what do I think? I think Protestant Reformation. When I think 1600s, what do I think? I think age of absolutism, okay, or English Civil War, or things along that nature. When I get into the 1700s, what do I think? I think about the Enlightenment. I think about the French and American revolutions. I think about, so you start to understand when things occurred. And putting those into relation with one another, this helps you to build context around things in the class that might seem kind of random. So if you get asked a question about, say, a British politician in the 1830s, and you understand that this British politician in the 1830s is living among the rise of the Industrial Revolution, you can begin to make more sense of what kind of context that this historical actor was operating in, and understand that they wouldn't know stuff that happened ahead of the 1830s because they hadn't lived it yet, and that the things that they would have understood were the most recent events that happened right before the 1830s. Okay, and the reason that this is important is not necessarily for the memorization of dates. It's simply for building context around the various stimuli that you might be exposed to throughout the class, and in particular on exams. And then you want to start to develop content literacy. And what I mean by content literacy is that as you start to study history, and any other class, frankly, that you begin to start to feel comfortable enough to talk about history or your other classes with the same degree of comfort that you would talk about your own life. All right, you begin to one of the things that I used to do when I was young, and I haven't thought about this in years, but it's true. When I would become interested in something in school, particularly history, because I was always kind of a history kid, I would read about it, and then I would force whoever would listen to me, typically my mom or maybe my sister or someone like that, to sit down so I could tell the story to them. And you'd be surprised how effective that is in helping you get the facts straight. See, they say that if you really want to learn something, teach it. If you can sit down and teach someone else something that you learned, what it forces you to do is to get the story straight enough in your head to be able to explain it to somebody else in an articulate fashion without them becoming confused. And that really will help you learn the stuff. So I encourage you to be talking about it. I encourage you to expose yourself to videos. If you hear something that I talk about in class and I'm only able to talk about it for a short while, say the Black Death or something like that, and you want to learn more about it, we live in an era of unprecedented access to knowledge. I cannot tell you how many times I have learned something new simply by watching videos on YouTube. Okay, you could type in virtually anything these days onto YouTube, and you'll be able to pull up something that gives you a little bit more intimate and detailed explanation of whatever it is that you're trying to learn about. So be bold, do that. It's a cool thing to be able to do. And boy, how fun is it to learn something new? It's one of the greatest things to be a lifelong learner. Okay, moving on, time. Let's talk time for a minute here. We're going on to the next slide. I'm now on slide 3 of 22. Okay, so time is kind of a confusing phenomena to wrap your head around with relation to history. And that's because time as we conceptualize it today is actually a relatively new concept. Consider that the people, for the vast majority of the years that we're going to be covering in this class, that the people who lived throughout those years, vast majority of them would not have owned a clock. In particular, the farther back that we go, they wouldn't have understood anything about really even how to tell time, because the only people who would have been able to afford something like a clock would have been somebody who would have been very, very wealthy in the first place. And so time was very not formalized, okay? You could be living in the middle of a nameless hamlet in the middle of a forest somewhere in Central Europe, and the only thing that you had to tell time was the position of the sun in the sky. All right. Perhaps maybe your local city center had like a sundial where you'd be able to get some relative rough idea of things. Consider that they didn't have time zones. There was no need to have time zones because the vast majority of people in Europe for hundreds of years going back to the Roman Empire would never have gone even farther than about a 2-mile radius away from the location that they were born. And I want you to imagine just how different that is. Because if you were born, say, here in Eastvale and never went more than a 2-mile radius around where you were born, that would mean that probably you wouldn't get outside of Eastvale your entire life. From the moment that you were born to the moment that you lay your head in the grave, you don't leave a 2-mile radius. And that was people's existences. There was no reason, no ability, no way, really, for people to leave their home. And then also, they didn't have things like modern transportation systems. They don't have planes. They don't have, they have ships, but they don't have trains. There's no way where somebody would have been able to travel rapidly enough in order to even necessitate time zones. So when we see the Industrial Revolution come around, it's really train stations that make it apparent that to keep a train schedule on time, you can't just be constantly going by whatever local township has for their local time. Otherwise, trains would be constantly arriving late, arriving early, maybe arriving before they even left. The other time, it would make no sense. So they started to need to formalize time zones during the Industrial Revolution. We don't talk about any BC years in this class, that is to say, before Christ, or BCE, before the Common Era, because our class doesn't go back that far. All of the years that we cover in this class are considered AD, which means Anno Domini, or in the year of our Lord, or what we would call in non-religious terms, the Common Era, okay, or the current era, okay. This class focuses solely on the years 1450 up to, I'll say, maybe a little bit after 2000, maybe up to 2010 or something like that. Maybe a little bit more recently with things like Brexit and stuff. But for the most part, all of the questions that you will be asked will be falling within that date range there. And then centuries. I talk about centuries a lot in this class. And so if I refer to the 20th century, note that we are in the 21st century, but the first 2 years of the year are 20, not 21. So in the 21st century, we're referring to the 2000s. In the 20th century, we're referring to the 1900s. In the 19th century, we're referring to the 1800s, and so on and so on. So keep in mind that whenever I refer to the century that we're talking about, it's referring to the previous 100 years of that number, if that makes sense. Okay, here we go. Moving forward, basics, Roman numerals. You probably known Roman numerals for a good long time, but it's good to review Roman numerals because we use them to designate titles of kings. So for example, Henry IV is very different than Henry VI. And also another thing to keep in mind about that is that when we talk about Henry IV, we need to designate of where. So there's a Henry IV of England, but there's also a Henry IV of France, okay? And they don't exist at the same time. They're not of the same dynasty. They're completely different people. They live completely apart from one another in history, but they are different people. And Roman numerals, if you get them backwards, can be quite confusing, not only for your reader, but for you. So it's good to know how to do Roman numerals. You'll note before there, Louis XIV of France, who we will talk about, is very different from Louis XVI of France. And so just keep that in mind, that it's good to have them straight. Okay, here we go, moving forward. All right, next thing's a map. It's a global map, right? This is the world. And if you click one more time, you'll see it is made up of 7 continents or land masses, all right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And as we go through them, you probably know this. I'm going to guess that probably you learned your continents somewhere in around 1st or 2nd grade. North America, South America. So going in order, 1 is North America, 2 is South America, 3 is Africa, 4 is, of course, Europe, 5 is Asia, 6 is Australia, and 7 is Antarctica. Okay, the next slide here, it says the basics geography. And now we have a zoomed in continental map of Europe. This is a political map because of the way that it's drawn, although you do see a little bit of texture for mountain ranges in there. But for the most part, this is a political map. And you can tell that by the way the countries are colored. Now, today, when we look at a map of Europe, or really a map of anywhere, it could be a map of Africa or North America or wherever we're talking about, we conceptualize of modern geopolitics in a particular way. And the way that we conceptualize of modern geopolitics is we identify nation states, okay? What is a nation? What is a state? Let's clear that up right away. A nation is really not a place. It's a people. It's a group of people who identify under a national moniker of some sort. All right. A nation state is the place in which those people reside. So when we think of countries, we're really talking about the places that nations live. Okay. So we identify our modern global context means that when we think of borders, we're thinking of the borders of a country, and that the people within those borders live as nation, as citizens of that nation. Okay. The reason I'm taking time to explain this is because, frankly, this is a relatively new phenomenon in history, and it didn't develop overnight. It's been developing for a couple of hundred years now, and been in place for about a little more than a century, or just about 2 centuries, really. Okay, but the idea being that when we go back in time, when I take you out of your modern historical discourse, when I take you, if you're that fish swimming in the stream of history, okay, and I plunk you out of 2020 and I drop you 600 years back in the stream when we go back to the late Middle Ages, they do not conceptualize of the land masses as sovereign nations. Okay, the sovereignty in olden times rested with a monarch. Okay, so we're dealing with primarily monarchies. All right, empires, if you will, kingdoms, realms. Okay, it wasn't conceptualized as like a centralized nation state with a government, and in particular in modern times, a democratic government in most of Western Europe, right? Democracy, here's the thing that's kind of weird for you. As much as we all take for granted that democracy is pretty much the modern standard for Western nations across the globe, democracy was a form of government that had not been used anywhere in the world, going all the way back to the fall of the Roman Empire in about 450 AD or so. All right, and so democracy falls out of favor as a form of governance, and instead it is replaced by a very strict hierarchical and what we call feudal society, where you have a king at the top of the society and a whole litany of different nobles of different ranks who have their position beneath the king. It's a very hierarchical society, and it goes down the chain of command all the way down to peasants, and even below peasants, people like serfs and slaves, which we'll get to a little bit later. So this is a modern map of Europe, and you can see various nations there. I suggest to you that you become familiar with the map of Europe. When I talk about the modern map of Europe, that is, the map changes over time. When I show you the next slide in a moment here, and you can skip forward and see it yourself if you like, the next slide, in fact, let's just do that. You'll see there that this map is roughly what Europe would have looked like in the year 1099, okay, 1099. Now, why is this significant? It's the same landmass. Continentally, Europe has changed very little over the course of the last 1,000 years. The landmass has stayed the same, largely, okay, with the exception of ocean levels and things like that. But the point being that pretty much the landmass is the same shape, okay? However, the borders that we draw as humans on the surface of the land are very, very, very different. And that's something to keep in mind, because I think probably as a youngster, you probably think to yourself, well, the borders are what the borders are, and the borders don't change because those are Germany's lands and that's France's lands, and that's how it is. Well, the truth of the matter is that as you go through time, the borders are very fluid. They're constantly changing, okay? And they are not set, all right? The land begins to be warred over and annexed and taken over. Some countries disappear for a period of time. Others of them come back after a period of time. Others war and battle over land. You can see on this map here, northern France was partly controlled by England at that time. All right, and that's because the the Duke of Normandy was a French noble who ended up taking over England. Okay, and so actually England was ruled by a French guy for a long time. And in fact, in England, they even used French as their official language for about 300 years. Okay, so and so the borders change a lot. All right, the borders change a lot, and that's something to keep in mind. But nonetheless, I encourage you, click one more, and you'll see again, two more. You'll see another map. This one's very colorful. And on this map, you can see, all the countries of modern day Europe. That includes places like Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Romania, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, Greece, Italy, etc., all the names that you know. I ask that you commit some of these names to memory geographically. The idea being that when I talk about Italy, when I talk about Germany, when I talk about Poland, that gives you an idea to say, I know where that is on the map relative to other places. If I say Germany and Poland go to war with one another, you have some idea perspective-wise of where that's happening. All right, Italy and Germany are interesting cases because it's only recently, and I'll say, when I say recently, I'm referring to the late 1800s, which in the scheme of history is pretty recent because it was only a couple hundred years ago. But they only recently became unified states. For the vast majority of this class, Germany, or the areas that we now consider Germany, used to be referred to as the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, which famously was called out by Voltaire in the 1700s as being neither holy nor Roman nor a true empire. But the point being that Germany only unified in 1871. For those of you keeping track, that's about a century after the United States becomes a nation. Italy, just shortly before Germany had unified, right around the year 1860 or so. All right, and so for the vast majority of these times, these states were very fragmented. They were fragmented into smaller states, smaller principalities, smaller duchies or kingdoms, all right? France, on the other hand, England, on the other hand, Spain, on the other hand, all of these begin to centralize in right around the late 1400s, early 1500s, and are more centralized states than, say, Germany and Italy were, okay? But the map of Europe changes, and it's good to know where things are. Another quick note for you before we move on from the map. You're going to see Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, which are three countries that exist kind of between France and Germany there. Sometimes these nations are called the Low Countries. Don't get confused. When I say Low Countries, I'm not referring to North-South low. They actually exist in Northern Europe, of all things. So why do they call them the Low Countries if they're in the north and higher up on the map? It has to do with elevation. Okay, so Netherlands, Netherlands, Belgium, and less so Luxembourg. Luxembourg starts to become a little bit more mountainous, but these countries are sometimes referred to as the Low Countries, in case you ever hear me say that. Okay, let's move on to the next one. The basics, feudalism. What we're going to be talking about right now is the general societal structure of Europe. And what you're going to note as we talk about this is it's quite different from what you guys understand today in modern day society. Let me give you a couple examples of things that would stick out to you as being very, very different from what you perceive to be just how the world is, or what we'll call your historical discourse. Your historical discourse is that you have natural rights as an individual: life, liberty, property, not the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness was from Thomas Jefferson. I'm talking about John Locke. John Locke wrote, he was a political philosopher in the late 1600s, wrote that individuals, and really in his time he was talking about men who were nobles who owned land, but we have extended this definition out in the last few hundred years, that you have, as an individual, natural rights of life, liberty, and property. You are a believer, most likely, in things like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights here in the United States, which guarantees you things like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so on and so on. Okay, these rights are completely non-existent to anyone for virtually the entire class. Okay, so already that alone, things that you take as just fundamental principles of how the world works, so quote unquote, okay, are just non-existent. They just don't exist in Europe at that time. In fact, it would have been absurd to consider that people had individual rights. Individualism was expressly discouraged in feudal Europe. Okay, quite the opposite. They encouraged uniformity. They encouraged everybody to be the same. And by that, I do not mean equal. Okay, I mean that they all meant that people should be uniformly Christian, because the main social construct that informed people's understanding of the world during this time was Christianity. We'll get to religion in a little bit. I don't want to spoil the surprise on that. But we have to understand that in this time, we are living in what is considered to be a very, very rigid social hierarchy. Okay, everybody, everything, plant, animal, person of any rank of society had a known, orderly place on the rank of being, okay, on the hierarchy of being, okay? And that went all the way up to God, all the way down to the lowliest insect crawling on the ground. There are places for everything, and the expectation was, just like in the military, you know your place. You know your place, you stay in your place, you do not challenge anyone who exists above you in that hierarchy. All right. Couple of things again. Think about individualism and freedom and how integral these are to the United States and the American identity. All right. Here in the United States, you have a whole lot of freedom to essentially do what you like, so long as there are not laws that expressly prohibit you from doing those things. And typically the laws that are created are to crack down on illicit behaviors that are destructive to society, crime, if you will. Okay, theft, drugs, murder, all of these kinds of things. Okay, we have laws about these things because they are seen as not conducive to a functioning society. On the other hand, there's a whole lot of freedom that you do have. If you want to grow up and become a shoe salesman, you can do that. If you want to become a hot dog stand owner, you can do that. If you want to ride bicycles professionally, you can do that. Whatever it is, you can pretty much do it. All right, and as long as you go along with the laws of society, and if you wanted to open up a restaurant, you could. There are certain rules about that because you got to make sure that you're not poisoning your customers and so on. But you can pretty much do whatever you like, so long as that there's not a law that says that you can't. All right. Almost exactly the opposite in Europe. And this is going to be hard for you maybe as a 10th grader to wrap your head around, but this is the honest truth about it, which is that in society, the vast majority of Europe, of feudal society of Europe in the Middle Ages, all right, and really beyond the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and the 15 and 1600s, okay, you really could not do anything. Okay, you assumed that you were not allowed to do anything. Not that your idea is I can pretty much do anything so long as there isn't a law that says that I can't. All right. The assumption for the feudal-minded man or woman was I cannot do anything unless I have been given express permission to do something. Think about how radically different that is from the perspective of somebody living in the 21st century. It sounds very foreign to us. It sounds almost absurd. The other thing is that in this time, wealth is nearly impossible to accumulate. Why? Well, you have to remember that they're living in a pre-industrial era. The vast majority of society in modern day times lives in cities. To accumulate wealth in modern times necessitates that you get a job, that you perform some kind of wage labor to earn a living, to be able to fund your life, your existence, okay? That is not how the world operated back in the Middle Ages and even up to about the Industrial Revolution. The vast majority of people in the Middle Ages did not live in urban areas, they lived in rural areas, countryside, nameless shires or hamlets in the middle of nowhere, anywhere in Europe. As we've gotten more advanced with our technology, particularly with relation to transportation, the world has become a much smaller place. You could, for example, you could buy a plane ticket to Italy or Japan or wherever you want to go, and be there within about a day, right? And you'd have to spend money on it, but it would be very doable. In those olden days, there was virtually no way to get anywhere, and that made the world a much bigger place because it's very difficult and dangerous to travel away from your home. It was also very dark. They don't have lights or highways or anything like that, right? It's a very, very difficult place to live. And as such, it was very unlikely that a person would leave much more than about a mile or two radius away from their birthplace. And once again, I'd like you to imagine your entire existence from birth until death, not leaving Eastvale or more than about a mile or two from your home. That's not very far. But if you strayed much farther than that, the likelihood of you ever finding your way home was pretty low. Okay, also, we're living in a pre-scientific, pre-medicine era. This is almost impossible to fathom to the modern human, all right, who lives in the 21st century. Any one of you could take a look at the sun rising in the east, moving across the sky, and setting in the west throughout a day and say, oh, well, although I see the sun moving, I understand on a fundamental level that the sun is not moving, the earth is moving around the sun. But you don't feel the earth moving, okay? You don't feel the earth moving. You are not able to see the earth move, okay? And so by common sense, if you were to suggest to somebody living in the late Middle Ages, oh, the sun's not actually moving, we're the ones moving, okay? How many words? There isn't a word, Nahal, there's not a word limit or like minimum. My suggestion to you is just answer the question thoroughly, okay? There's no like, I'm not gonna be counting the words. It's a waste of time, and it's a waste of time for you. The thing that's most important is that you answer it, and that if you were asked the question later, you'd be able to recall what you wrote and explain it with an adequate answer. So do as much as necessary. You don't need to go completely overboard. Some of them might, the answers for the reading guide questions, some of them might be longer, some of them might be shorter. I would say do what's necessary for you to learn it. That's what's important. Okay, so to get back to the lecture. Science and medicine were extremely slow to develop. I want you to consider something for a minute here, all right? Imagine that you became ill, okay? And not necessarily COVID, doesn't matter what it is. Let's say you need to get your appendix out, okay? Now, if you were to have your choice between going to a doctor in 1965, okay, let's say the best doctor in 1965, okay, or the best doctor in 2020, who are you going to choose? Well, naturally, you're going to choose the doctor from 2020. There's been a whole lot of medical knowledge, technology, and so on that has developed in the last 60 years that have contributed to medicine. To go to a doctor from 1965, even a really good one, would probably mean that the standard of care that you receive would drop quite significantly. All right, now why is this important? Because that's only 60 years ago, kids. There are tons and tons of people, including my own mom, probably some of your grandparents and so on, who were not only living through the 60s, but were born before the 60s, okay? So it's not that long ago, all right? Consider going back 600 years, all right, to the late Middle Ages. You can only imagine the kinds of barbaric practices that were used to treat people who were ill, okay? In fact, many of the sorts of treatments that these people used probably would have further endangered your life rather than offered you any sort of treatment for whatever ailed you. All right, understand that living in a pre-scientific era necessitated that people's explanations for anything were extremely mystical, they were extremely superstitious, they were not based in any sort of experimentation or inductive versus deductive reasoning, or what have you. In fact, the vast majority of all phenomena that occur around Europe was an explanation that came from the Bible. There was always a religious connotation or some other kind of superstitious connotation for why things happen. God is punishing people, for example. Let's say something simple, even though simple things people couldn't explain. Common sense would say, I don't feel the earth move. I see the sun move across the sky. It stands to reason that common sense dictates that the sun is the thing that's moving, not earth. But that's wrong. But you could understand why people believed it, because it seems to make sense. Common sense, you'll find, is a really terrible, terrible way of explaining phenomena. All right. If you were to go for a run or go for a heavy workout or whatever, and you throw your wet, sweaty clothes in a corner somewhere, and a few days later they've got mold and other creepy crawlies growing on them, what's the explanation for it? Well, obviously, okay, I threw it in the corner. It was wet. It created a moist environment for bacteria and other viruses to flourish, and they began to grow on it, and so on and so forth. You have a basic understanding of biology to be able to explain something simple. People in the Middle Ages don't. They don't even know what a virus is, okay? They couldn't explain to you that bacteria exist. To them, it was evil spirits, miasmas that floated through the air and pervaded people's spirits and so on and so forth like that. They don't have any explanation for any black magic and other things of that nature would be just as viable of an explanation for things as any sort of other explanation. And to question it would have only drawn suspicion on you. You did not question things. You accepted what was understood about the social discourse of religion and the influence of Christianity and God and so on and so forth in everyday matters. Why'd my house burn down? It's probably because I was a sinner and God wanted to punish me. It wasn't because I left the stove on. It wasn't because of whatever else. It was because of something superstitious, something mystical, okay? So hopefully you get that. All right, let's move forward. The basics. All right, feudalism, paternalism, hierarchy. Remember that we're living in a highly, highly patriarchal time. Very patriarchal, and what that means is male-dominated society. Now, I am not at all trying to undercut the influence of women across history. Women have played some very, very, very important roles. I believe there's a famous quote that says, behind every great man is an even greater woman. But we have to come to terms with the reality of the situation, which is that in practice, women had a very subordinate role to men throughout a lot of Western history. And I think the argument could even be made today that although progress has been made, maybe still due in a lot of places. Okay, so land. Land's the most important asset. People didn't work jobs for wage labor back in those days. 90% of people living in Europe were peasants. Illiterate peasants, that's another thing. How could you ever even question the world around you if you can't read or write? They wouldn't be able to read their own name if you gave it to them. Okay, if you can't read or write, you don't have any of the tools to be able to question the world around you in the first place. And the world, you could imagine, would be a very frightening place if you didn't understand what caused illness and had even less of an idea of how to cure it. Land is the most important asset as a result. And so money does not circulate very freely. The types of money that people had would have been things like gold coins, florins or something like that, groschen, okay? These would have been the types of currencies that floated around, but they weren't exchanged between commoners because there was no way for them to acquire any in the first place, okay? And also, there's no inflation, meaning that no new currency is ever being made because the only thing that made currency valuable was the fact that it was made out of precious metals. And for the last 1,000 years, there were no new precious metals being mined in Europe or brought in from other places because they didn't know of anything to do with North America or South America at the time. Okay, so there's really very, very limited wealth circulating around, and it only ever would have circulated around the upper 1 or 2% of the population of nobles and clergy being people of the church. Okay, so why is land the most important asset? Well, land brought wealth to the people who owned it, which were nobles. Nobles were at the top of society. How do you become a noble? Well, there's really only one way by the time that we get to the Middle Ages to become a noble, and that is to be born one. And again, there are women nobles, but the male nobles had more political influence, and women were largely barred from having political influence in any sort of official capacity, either in secular institutions such as the government or religious institutions such as the Roman Catholic Church. So when we talk about the passing on of this wealth, the passing on of this noble title, it is given to the eldest son of the house. Now, what happens if there are no children? Well, in those scenarios, it would maybe go to a younger brother, perhaps a cousin or an uncle, or somebody of that nature. The closest male elder relative to the previous person who just passed on. All right, land is very, very important, but the vast majority of people in Europe don't own the land that they live on. They are tenants on the land. They live on the land, they farm the land, they live off the land, but they are doing subsistence style farming. That is to say, they only grow enough every year to be able to basically support themselves. When I talk about peasants, I'm not talking about the type of labor that, say, the African slaves performed during the Middle Passage years of the 15, 16, 1700s. The kinds of work that peasants performed was largely localized work to do just about as much work as you needed to for the day. And then for the most part, there was a lot of dysfunctional drama that would happen locally that people would consume themselves with, going to taverns, getting in fights, getting married, having kids, and so on and so on. People used to have a lot of kids back in those days because it was more common for children not to survive to adulthood. Going back to that whole medicine thing, they didn't have any idea how to cure even the common illnesses like strep throat or whatever else, not to mention the various plagues that hit Europe and stuff like that. So the land, the official title, the estate, was typically passed down to the eldest son by the noble family. The commoners would stay commoners. Peasants stay peasants. If you were a peasant, your children would be peasants, your grandchildren would be peasants, just like your parents were peasants and your great-grandparents and your great-great-great-grandparents all the way up the chain. There was really no such thing as rags to riches. Okay, it just did not really happen that way. There are a couple of exceptions to this for people who we call kind of the middle class. When I say the middle class, though, I'm not referring to a large segment of society the way that we think of it today. All right, the middle class was a group of people who were kind of merchants or artisans. They were probably skilled in some sort of way, trained in some sort of way, maybe a master of some sort of craft, could be, sword making or silversmithing or shoemaking or whatever it is, doesn't matter what it is. These people may have been able to scratch out enough of an existence in a small urban center to be able to earn enough wealth and be able to then purchase a noble title. But that doesn't happen really until about the mid-1600s. Okay, so how did you become a noble in the first place? How did the original nobles come about? Well, they're called nobles of the sword. And the original nobles came about because perhaps they were like a tribesman leader and they already had a significant following, so they took on a noble title. Perhaps they defeated somebody in a battle or what have you. All right, there were a number of ways going generations, hundreds and hundreds of years back, that people originally became nobles. But pretty much for the most part, the only way to become a noble is to be born a noble. And so kings are powerful at this time. But another thing to remember about the kingdoms across Europe is that king's power was constantly being challenged by all sorts of people, distant relatives, even siblings, cousins, uncles, nephews, you name it. Constantly their challenge, their authority was being challenged by other nobles. That's why legitimacy was such an important thing for kings to be able to maintain, to say, I am the legitimate monarch, my children are the legitimate successors to the dynasty, and so on and so forth. But similarly, if a king didn't have children, if the king died, it would go to the nearest relative. Now, in the early days, kings are not absolute rulers. And in fact, you might even make the historical argument that even at the height of the age of absolutism, during the mid-1600s, that the absolute monarchs of the time did not have true absolute power. Once again, they're being challenged by all sorts of different institutions, whether it be city governments, other nobles, especially nobles who live in distant regions away from the king, the church, and so on. All right, there are a number of different ways in which king's power was being challenged at any given time. In the late Middle Ages, this was an even truer statement, and that's because there really was no central authority or way for a king to travel across huge distances of land, say in France. Now, France today we don't think of as a particularly large geographical space, but if you were living in the 1300s, France would feel pretty darn huge to you. And so kings wouldn't be traveling and checking up on distant nobles who lived in the southern part of France. Okay, the nobles then of those regions would locally be administering their affairs, and as you could imagine, this would result in a lot of what's the word that inconsistency in how laws were regulated, how crimes were punished, and other things like that. All right, so there's not a whole lot of statewide systems in place that protect the king's authority as we go all the way back to the late Middle Ages. We start to see the beginnings of some centralization when we get to the Renaissance. Okay, moving forward to the social political terms you must know. These are terms that I might be using in the lecture or throughout the rest of the year that would probably be good for you to know. This could include words like, for example, secular. Secular is a word that I'll use a lot throughout the year, and all secular means is just non-religious. Okay, so you've got religious and you've got secular, and they're somewhat of opposites of one another. Let's see, what's another? Regent. A regent might be a word that I use. Here's what a regent is. Let's say a king dies. Yes, very good, Manal. Let's say a king dies, okay, and leaves behind like a 5-year-old boy. Now that 5-year-old is going to be the next king, but obviously you can't leave the kingdom of France to be run by a child, okay? So what would happen is the king would designate what's called a regent, and the regent would be a figure within the court, within the king's court, who would manage the day-to-day affairs, help to train the child into becoming a proper monarchical figure. All right, so that's what a regent is. Think of it as like a supervisor until the young boy comes of age to become king. Interregnum would be another term related to that. All interregnum means is between reigns. So let's say a king dies and you have a period of time where there is no king because there's no heir, there's no distant relatives, or maybe there's upheaval or something like that. If there is no king for a period of time and then we eventually get another king, that would be known as the interregnum period. Noble, aristocrat, we talked about that. Those are kind of exchangeable terms. Feudalism is the entire system of kings, nobles, and so on. Peasants that we're looking at. A pestilence is simply like a blight. Nepotism is favoring your family members for positions of authority. This happened a lot in the church and in political situations as well. And by the way, still does. Like, for example, President Trump named his own daughter and his son-in-law and other things like that to various positions within the administration. And that would technically be an example of nepotism. Corruption, vassal's a good one for you to know. On that hierarchy, when we're talking about that hierarchy, remember it's rigid. Everybody has their designated place on the hierarchy. If you're referring to somebody who is above you on that hierarchy, you refer to them as my lord, okay? Lord. A lord is anyone who exists above you, higher in the chain of command. On the other hand, if you're referring to somebody who is below you on the chain of command, you refer to them as your vassal. And that could be no matter where you are you could be a duke and still refer to the king as your lord, okay? You could be an earl and refer to everyone beneath you as your vassal, okay? Urban versus rural, hopefully you know the difference between those two words. Urban is more city, rural is more countryside. There aren't a lot of major cities at this time. And then as you click one more, you can see the medieval social hierarchy there. And of course, at the top, God, kings, dukes, earls, counts, marquis, marquess, barons. And then we get into, after barons, you get into what's known as lesser nobles. So knights were at kind of the top of the lesser nobles. Then you had squires beneath them. And then beneath squires, you had like gentry, lesser lords, okay? Almost kind of like upper middle class, you might think of it almost like, okay? And then beneath them, you have your commoners, okay, who are going to be people who don't have any sort of noble title, but perhaps they live in a city. Maybe they're a merchant. Maybe they are an artisan of some sort, not an artist. Well, maybe an artist, but artist and artisan are different things. And then like people like masons, perhaps, people who do some sort of trade work. Those are going to be like your commoners. Beneath them, you've got peasants. Beneath them, you've got serfs. And beneath them, you've got slaves. Okay, so moving forward. The basics. Let's talk a little bit about religion. I am running low on time here, but I'm going to get done with talking about religion, talk to you a little bit about Persia, and then I'm going to give the rest of the time to you. So it'll take me pretty much right up to the end here. All right, let's talk a little bit about religion and just how quintessentially important it is to talk about in the context of European history. All right. Yeah, it will help you a lot. Manal is right about that. All right, let's talk about religion. So there's no way of understanding European history without respecting and acknowledging the profound influence that Christianity had on not just Europeans' religion, but their entire framework of understanding everything, okay? Religion, particularly the Roman Catholic Church in the late Middle Ages, was absolutely paramount to understanding one's position in the world, okay? There was no separating the two. You could not separate your existence from religion because your existence was built upon the entire social framework of Christianity. Now, we need to be clear about this because a lot of times, and I've been teaching this a lot, or I've been teaching this for many years now, a lot of times I run into issues where people are a little bit confused on these terms. Christian, Catholic, whatever, okay? Let's get this straight right away, all right? So I'm just gonna tell you how it is. This is not up for debate, it's just facts, okay? Again, when I talk about religion in this class, I'm not here to be your spiritual advisor. I'm here to talk to you about religion from this perspective of history, okay? So let's talk about it. Going back to 360 AD, there was an emperor. His name was Constantine of the Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine was the first to create Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, at this time, there is no other kind of Christianity than Roman Catholic, okay? In fact, that word Catholic, if you look it up in the dictionary, Catholic just means general, really, okay? It just means general practice of something, general way of doing something. So when we say Roman Catholic, we're talking about general Christianity as practiced by the Romans. For a long time, centuries upon centuries, Roman Catholicism was the only kind of Christianity, okay? Until we get to a schism in the church. A schism is a split in the church. And it happened over the issue of the liturgy, which is the beginning part of Mass, okay? And so what ended up happening was this schism in the church, people in Eastern Europe, particularly Greece, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, broke away from the Roman Catholic Church and established what became known as the Eastern Orthodox Church, okay? So for essentially the first 1,000 or more years, 1,200 years of Christianity, there were really only kind of two kinds of Christians, Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. It's not until we get to 1517 with Martin Luther, who nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral in Saxony, which was a state of the Holy Roman Empire, that we see another split in the faith. This is where we see the establishment of what become known as Protestant Christian faiths, okay? Root word being protest, and you'll find out why they were doing this when we get to the second unit of this class. I won't go into detail on that right now. Suffice it to say, there was a whole lot of corruption and not so nice things happening at the upper echelons of the Roman Catholic Church, which caused people to be very wary of it. Now, when Martin Luther breaks away from the Roman Catholic Church, keep in mind, he was raised Catholic. He was originally Catholic, but he breaks away from the church and establishes Lutheranism. And that starts a kind of precipitous domino effect of many different people breaking away from the church and establishing their own denominations that were individually catered to the region that they lived. So, for example, Calvinism. Calvinism is another Protestant faith, but you can even further subdivide Calvinism into, say, the Dutch Reformed Church, Puritans from England, Presbyterians from Scotland, Huguenots from France, and so on and so forth. And as the line goes down, we see more and more and more Protestant faiths develop after the 1500s. So, for example, this is where we eventually come up with other faiths like the Mennonites, the Quakers, what else? The Episcopalians down the line a long way, Methodists in America, Baptists in America. There's literally tons of them. I can't even think of all of them, but there's tons and tons and tons of Protestant faiths. Okay, and so, but they're all essentially protesting against the Roman Catholic Church. Nonetheless, all of these, whether you're Roman Catholic, whether you're Protestant, or whether you are Eastern Orthodox, all of them fall under the giant subheading of Christian. Okay, and that's important for you to understand. So, there was one other thing that I was going to talk about. Keep in mind that because most people were illiterate, they could not read. And what that meant was, even if you would have handed them a Bible, they would not have been able to read it. And one of the reasons that the Roman Catholic Church starts to become criticized by some of these Protestant reformers is because of the degree of elasticity that a lot of local parishes or priests had of explaining what was in the Bible. Now, keep in mind, if you were in a particularly remote place, perhaps your even local priest wouldn't have been able to read. Not to mention, remember that all Catholic Bibles, until we get up to the late early 1500s, were written in Latin, which was a language that had been dead for nearly 1,000 years. So even if you were literate, the chances that you could read Latin were even slimmer. And so what did this mean? Well, essentially what it meant was that this left the Bible open to a lot of openness in its interpretation. And some of these interpretations became very, 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 very loose interpretations. And this was heavily criticized by the Protestant reformers who wanted to stick to the literal words of Scripture written on the pages of the Bible, which of course meant for a much stricter version of Christianity. Okay, so that's another thing to keep in mind about how kind of the Catholic Church strayed a little bit from what the Protestants felt were the fundamental principles of Christianity. On the next slide, you can see the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy. Even within the church, they've got their own system of hierarchy. Like I say, everything has its place. God, the Pope was considered the living vessel of God on earth. What the Pope said was essentially God communing through his human vessel here on earth. Cardinals, archbishops, bishops, priests, deacons, monks, friars, nuns, and then all the way down at the bottom, your common laity or your common worshipers. Another thing to keep in mind about popes is that they have a birth name that they're given, but when they become part of the clergy, they take on what becomes known as a papal name. So, for example, Pope Sixtus V would not have actually, his name was not Sixtus, but he would have taken that name on as a papal name. Now, for kings, on the other hand, their birth name is the same as their title name. How does a king get a name? Well, a lot of times they're all named the same thing. If they're named Louis, spoiler alert, they're probably from France. Okay. So anyhow, and then two, you got to remember that sometimes the kings are from different places. So that's another thing to keep in mind. There's a Henry IV of France, but there's also a Henry IV of England. Okay, moving forward. So all phenomena in religion were explained by the Bible. Belief and common knowledge were used ahead of science and reason. Keep in mind, we're in a pre-scientific revolution time. Copernicus, Galileo, Isaac Newton, all of these guys don't exist yet. They're not going to come around until the future. To question the church is expressly prohibited. You do not question the church. You certainly don't question higher ranking members than you within the church. And it's the dominant framework for understanding everything. And remember, uniformity was expected. You do not step out of line. You do not challenge authority. You listen to your authority figures. And high-ranking ecclesiastical figures were also typically very wealthy, very powerful, very influential, even in a political, secular way, and also very, very willing to sin and do some not so good things. Okay, there's another list of terms that you should probably be familiar with. Papal, that's how you say that word. It's not papal, okay? It's papal, papacy, anything having to do with the Pope, of or related to the Pope. We'll talk more about like simony, schisms and things like that as we get into the Protestant Reformation. But piety is a term that simply means like religious devotion. So if you're very, very pious, that would mean that you're very religiously devoted. Again, we'll talk more about clericalism. I'm not going to go into that right now. A papal bull is like an official document. Celibacy is the idea that anyone who was a figure within the church should not be engaging in any sort of physical relationships with anyone. They weren't allowed to marry or have girlfriends or anything, although many of them did, which is one of the reasons that they start to be criticized. Clergy just means somebody within the church. Again, ecclesiastical, that just means of or related to the church. These are all kind of terms that I might throw out there in my lecture that you may want to just know for your own understanding. Okay, now finally we get to the very last little bit of today's lecture, and that is going to be talking about Persia. Now, I'm not actually referring to the location of Persia, which is now in modern day Saudi Arabia. Okay. All the way, actually, Iraq, Persia was huge. But anyway, the point is I'm not actually talking about real Persia. I'm talking about the acronym Persia that we're going to use to help to start to think about history from a number of different lenses. Okay, remember that when we talk about history, history is not just history. There's different avenues of history that people study. In particular, I consider myself very much an economic and social historian. Little bit political of a historian. I know a lot about politics, but really my strengths are in economic history and in social history. All right. But there are other kinds of historians. There's religious historians, there's art historians, there's intellectual historians, and there's political historians or military historians, right? There's all sorts of different kinds. And so, I specialize in a couple, as most people who make history their profession do, but we need to be aware of all of them. And that's why I've developed this. I didn't develop it, but I'm using it. This acronym that you can use to help you analyze documents within history from different viewpoints. So you can look at a document from, say, a political perspective, but maybe it will serve a dual purpose as an economic perspective, or sometimes not. Maybe it'll just be straight up intellectual history or art history or whatever it is. Okay, but the point being that as you do your DBQs, you're going to want to be able to look at a document and say, where am I looking at this in the scope of history? All right. And you guys are in 10th grade, so I don't expect you to be experts on what things are. But the next couple of slides helps to explain what each of these words could be referring to in the event that you were looking at a particular source or whatever. So let's move on to the next slide. Political, economic, religious, social, intellectual, artistic. That's what Persia stands for. So if we were to be talking about looking at a document and the document had something to do with the following factors, we consider it more of a political document. Anything to do with government, that it could include government officials or official court documents or government documents or whatever. Alliances or treaties between different kingdoms or down the line nations, wars between places, courts, anything to do with political parties, laws, legislation just means lawmaking. A legislator is a lawmaker, okay? So anything to do with lawmaking, laws, also anything to do with breaking laws like crime, punishment, all of those things are going to be considered political type history, okay? These aren't going to go in order, by the way, but we'll get through all of them. Let's talk about social history. What kinds of documents would be like a social history document? Well, it could be things like about education, meaning like what people were being taught, what segments of society were educated. Typically, only the wealthy nobles had an education and had the ability to become literate in the late Middle Ages and in the Renaissance and so on. Education has widened to more of the population as time goes on. Healthcare, what did people believe about healthcare at that time? Languages that people used, customs that people practiced in those times. Could be clothing, could be anything to do with like relationships, could be anything to do with beliefs about different segments of society or what have you. Anything to do with age, the age that people are living to, or the expectation of milestones that you should be doing at a certain age, like getting married or having kids or anything like that. Anything to do with ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, interactions between groups or classes. All of these are going to fall under social history, okay? Moving on, economic history. When we talk economics, what we're talking about is the exchange of goods or services on a market. And there are tons of markets. There could be markets everywhere. Some markets are kind of, they don't exist necessarily in a physical sense, but markets could be local, they could be global, they could be on the internet nowadays, and so on and so forth. So anything to do with buying and selling of goods, anything to do with money systems, currency, how much money people made could be considered more of a social thing, but how people how much money people made could be considered an economic thing, but how they made their money might be considered a social thing. You can see that the lines sometimes blur with one another. All right, anything to do with agriculture and industry, international trade, land, labor, capital, all of these things are economic history. Also, it could blend a little bit with political history, because with the economy, a lot of times the economy is very heavily regulated from the top down by the government. So the degree to which the government is interfering with or regulating or limiting the economy is another way that we would look at a document and say, this is an economic document. Intellectual factors could be things like writing, literature, philosophy, anything to do with new inventions, new innovations, the steam engine, whatever, math, science, new understandings about that. Literacy rates would be one. Education we talked about under social, but education could also be referring to what kinds of things are being taught in schools. Okay, so intellectually, what kinds of things would you be trained in? How did schools work at that time? Okay, so on and so forth. All right, religious factors, anything to do with sin, salvation, beliefs, teachings, holy books, deities, saints, clergy. And then a big one, Protestantism versus Catholicism. We're going to talk a lot about that in the early part of the class. And then finally, artistic factors. That would cover anything to do with paintings, sculptures, architecture, music, and then the various styles. We'll be talking about all sorts of different styles that develop throughout history. We'll be talking a lot about art in the first unit here, talking about the Renaissance and new techniques that were utilized in art, and even some very famous artists of the Renaissance. And then we will go all the way up through to the 20th century, talking about new developments in art as well, and architecture. So features of art would fall under artistic history. So anyhow, kids, all right, well, that covers everything that I wanted to cover for today, and I know that I'm coming up here to my limit on time. The rest of the time, I delegate to the floor. You may now utilize this time to finish or submit your assignment that was due for today. Please do that as soon as possible so that I may add that to the gradebook by this afternoon. If you do not have it handed in today, you can still hand it in on time. And yeah, I know. I went a little bit over today. I apologize about that, but I wanted to make sure I did a good job. So if you're done, go on to your next class. And if you're done with your assignment, make sure you submit it. Okay, that's all. Have a great day, everybody.